Well, hello everybody, and thank you very much to the organisers of this event. I'm very glad to have been invited to say a few words. I'm going to talk principally about the situation in Britain, but I thought it might be helpful just to perhaps lay out a few more international credentials. I did a quick calculation and I've worked out that I've actually examined over 40 doctoral theses from 16 different countries. So overall, over the many years that I've been doing this, I've got some sense of what's actually going on. I think the idea of moving towards a European doctorate and to lining up our different systems in a way that's going to be more coherent and more user-friendly and more exchange-friendly is really excellent. So I thought I'd start out by just saying a few words about what happens in Britain, how we go about monitoring, selecting our doctoral candidates in the humanities in general. And the first point is that we have a protocol, a set of protocols, guidelines, drawn up by our National Quality Assurance Agency, which are basically guidelines for all universities in how to select, supervise, monitor and examine doctoral theses. There are obviously huge variations from one institution to another, but basically the fundamentals remain the same, and these are the need for the doctoral candidate to have regular contact with the supervisor, the need for the supervisor to work closely with the student, but of course within certain boundaries so as not to actually write the thesis for them, and the need for there to be a safeguard so that if the relationship with the supervisor runs into difficulty, there is someone else who can intervene and offer assistance. My experience of supervising is that students are enormously variable. Some of them come in raring to go, some of them come in quite anxious. Some students require a lot of help in the first year of their study as they begin to build a bibliography and do a literature survey. Some of them don't require much help at all until they start to write. And the writing aspect is hugely important. In many British universities, and certainly my own university here at Warwick, we provide training courses in academic writing, in how to structure a doctoral thesis, in how to create footnotes, a whole series of academic skills that we think are important. But my view about what makes a successful PhD is not just the relationship with the supervisor. It is starting out with a clear idea of what it is that the individual wants to work on. And if I think back to problems over the years, the students who ran into problems are the ones who, for whatever reason, did not have a clear enough sense of what the PhD was going to be about. So, for example, the topic was far too vague and general, or, paradoxically, the topic was far too narrow. I want to work on that book by that author and the translation of that book by that translator, and that's problematic. The other big problem are those students who decide that they want to do a PhD, but they're not sure of the methodology, and I get a number of applications every year from people who want to write a PhD that will be entirely dependent on a certain kind of data collection based on questionnaires. And when we go into this in a little more depth, you find, or sometimes you find, that students have never had any experience of writing a questionnaire, of conducting questionnaires, and the validity of that kind of research is then called into question. It would obviously be possible in some places, and I'm sure it happens, to provide training in how to devise questionnaires. But I tend to be a little bit concerned about those dissertations that seem to be entirely dependent on getting questionnaire responses. I was told a horror story the other week by a supervisor who had a student working on a doctoral thesis whose data was dependent on receiving information from publishers about translations. And she had received practically nothing and was in despair as to how she was actually going to devise a thesis when there was no data. So I think it's very important to establish what the thesis is, what the methodology is, right from the start. What I also tell my incoming students is that just because they've established a clear methodology and a clear set of parameters doesn't mean that the thesis can't grow and change, because it's essential that it does grow and change. And so as a general rule of thumb, I tend to say if you are still thinking in the same way at the end of 2 years, when you should be really seriously into writing, then there's something wrong because your ideas haven't developed. I want to just come on now to thinking for a moment or two about research in translation studies, because I think we're at a very critical moment. The field has become established. A lot of people are using the phrase translation studies to refer to programs at first degree level, at master's level, and also in doctoral dissertations. But I don't know that I'm clear that there is a consensus about what people understand by translation studies. And I also think that it's important that as the subject field evolves, there's continual dialogue with people working in a range of other subjects. One of the problems that one can see is translation studies setting itself up in a kind of little bunker, people defining themselves as translation studies people and not reaching out. Whereas what made the subject exciting in its early stages was the multidisciplinarity. There's some tremendously good work going on in terms of translation and the internet, translation and memory studies, translation and comparative literature, translation and globalization studies. And I do see this as the way that we should be trying to direct our students, not the somewhat now hackneyed and dull model of a literature survey followed by an individual case study. I seem to have read quite a lot of those lately, and when I read something that goes beyond a literature survey and an individual case study, I rejoice. I read an excellent PhD on translating humour just the other week and thought, yes, this is where we should be going. So more innovation, more thought to the proposal in the first instance, proper training and support programs, and more of this kind of dialogue between colleagues from different countries. Thank you.